Continuing our reflection on Paul's time in the city of Ephesus. There are three main things that are covered in Acts chapter 19. And that is this incident where Paul meets these 12 men. And although they had been baptized, and they had been baptized for the forgiveness of sins, because that was a part of John's baptism, yet there was something missing. There was something incomplete. And so Paul, having had this conversation and study with them, he re-immersed them in the name of Jesus. And that's how this time of Paul in Ephesus begins. And then there's the section that summarizes his work. We talked about this last week. You can reflect upon these developments in the narrative according to this description of his teaching, and then this unique section about his miracle working, and this expression of Paul doing extraordinary miracles. And this, as we studied over the last couple weeks, may have been because Ephesus was an extraordinary place. It was extremely superstitious in its worship of the goddess Diana, and we see then what develops from that here in the latter part of this chapter as it's devoted to one incident. Now, Paul spent about 3 years in Ephesus, and all of chapter 19 is about Paul's time in Ephesus. But as we think about it, we have one incident described with the immersion of the 12. We have a summary of his work, especially his miracles. And then we have a large section of the chapter devoted to one thing that happens out of that entire 3-year span. And it is this riot that develops in the city of Ephesus. Before we get into that part of the chapter, which goes from verse 23 all the way to the end of the chapter, we'll talk about Paul's travel plans for just a minute, as this then is found in verses 21 and 22. Let's read this together. After the summary of his work, chapter 19, verse 20, the word of the Lord increased and prevailed mightily. Then it says in verse 21, now after these things, after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia. Now, Macedonia and Achaia are two areas of the country of Greece. Macedonia in the northern part, Achaia in the southern part of Greece. We normally think about this area in terms of specific cities and even New Testament letters. So this right here, we're talking about Paul's third missionary journey. On his second missionary journey, he went to Macedonia and Achaia for the first time. And what were some of those cities? Well, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, and then Athens and Corinth. So Paul is thinking now, being in Ephesus, that he would like to travel north and then west and then going around the sea if he walks by land. He goes up and around and then drops down into Greece. He says, I want to go back to Macedonia and Achaia. I want to go back to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth. He wants to visit these congregations. So we get in our minds what Paul is intending to do. So he wants to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and then go to Jerusalem. And he was saying this as well. after I have been there, I must also see Rome. Now, hold your place right here. It may be the same page or it may be turning a page, but look at the beginning of Acts chapter 20. Verse 1. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. And then we just have a very brief statement about where he went and who he was with. And by the time we get down to verse 5, these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi, that's in Macedonia. So between verse 1 and verse 5 has been his entire stay without any details. So it says he went to Macedonia, really nothing is said about all of that. And then he sails away from there and he heads on, at least in the direction of Jerusalem. And on that return trip, he's going to meet with the elders from Ephesus. So we'll have that to anticipate. But what I'm explaining here is that we have Paul anticipating going to Macedonia. We read that he goes to Macedonia and Achaia. And we can pull from various things that he writes in his letters about this period of time. And so since we're kind of at that moment where Paul is in Ephesus and he's anticipating going into Macedonia, we read in chapter 20 he goes into Macedonia, but really nothing is said. Let's just take a minute to think about some of the things that actually happen that he mentions in his letters. First of all, we know in this particular period of time that he has received some discouraging news from the church in Corinth. When we read 1 Corinthians and we discover all of the problems that were going on with Christian people there, we also read that Paul was in Ephesus when he writes that letter. So it's in this particular general period of time that Paul writes 1 Corinthians. Now something else happens. Paul leaves Ephesus and goes and makes a visit to Corinth that's unrecorded in the book of Acts. He leaves Ephesus and he goes and visits Corinth. Now, how do we know that? We know that because Paul mentions this in 2 Corinthians. Now, 1 Corinthians is written when he is in Ephesus. When he leaves Ephesus and he goes north and he comes over into Macedonia, when he is in Macedonia, he writes 2 Corinthians. So they're not all that far apart in terms of time. But 2 Corinthians is where we learn a little bit more of what's been going on. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians 13 verses 1 and following, as he's traveling in that direction, he says, this is the third time I'm coming. Now, we don't have to be all that good at math or counting or anything to know that if this is the third time, how many times have preceded that? 2. The first time is when he established the church. Acts 20 and verse 1 says he travels into that area. If all we had was Acts, we would think it's the second visit. But Paul says, no, actually that's the third visit. Now what about this second visit? Paul, as he is giving some perspective on his work and his concern for the Christians in Corinth. Talks about early in 2 Corinthians of how sorrowful, how sad he was when he went to visit them on this, what we now know is a second visit. So sometime during Acts chapter 19, he goes to Corinth. It's after he's written 1 Corinthians, but before he writes 2 Corinthians. Now, with that little bit of framework, let's just think about what's on Paul's mind. We draw on 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians written right here at this period of time to add a little bit of understanding into what Paul is experiencing. If we're reading Acts chapter 19, we're thinking about Ephesus, and we're thinking about Paul's teaching, and we're thinking about the opposition from the Jews in the synagogue for 3 months, and then receiving that opposition and going to the school of Tyrannus and preaching daily in the school of Tyrannus, and then all these unusual miracles and all of the expanse of the gospel. Well, while he's doing all this, he's worried about the people in Corinth. So somewhere in his schedule, he learns about they've got real trouble. And he writes a letter. Still continuing his work in Ephesus, but he writes this letter. And then he learns that it's not been received well by everyone. And he goes to visit to try to continue to address the problems, and it does not go well. And this now has weighed heavy on him. So there is a very interesting passage that we can add into right now from 2 Corinthians as Paul is explaining a little bit about his travel plans. I'll read this to you, or you could turn over there in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 if you'd like. And look in 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 1 first. Paul said, "For I made up my mind not to have another painful visit to you." What does that say about the visit he had? Painful. Now, as he writes this letter, he says, it's the third time I'm coming. So this is the reference to the second visit here. Not the first time when he established the church, but the second visit, sometime during Acts 19, was painful. Now, look at verse 12. When I came to Troas, now do you know when that is? Acts 20, verse 1. We know he writes 2 Corinthians from Macedonia. We know he left Ephesus to go to Macedonia. Well, he passes through Troas. Troas was north of Ephesus. So 2 Corinthians 2 and verse 12 can be plugged into Acts 20 and verse 1 in terms of the description of his travel. Now here's why we're talking about this. When he leaves Ephesus and he is traveling north, he comes to Troas. That's what he says here. When I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was open for me in the Lord. What does that mean? What does it mean when he says there was a door open for me? Right. That's the perfect word. There was an opportunity to preach the gospel. What did he say? My spirit was not at rest because I did not find my brother Titus there. Okay, this is the day before telegraphs, telephones, emails, or any of that, right? And by word of mouth and by premeditated plans, he had hoped to find Titus in Troas. And can you imagine in that day, you probably don't anticipate going to Troas and thinking, there he'll be waiting for me. And if he's not there within 5 minutes, I'm already anxious. No, it might be days. He might think, well, he's going to be here any day now. And how long did he wait? How many days went by? And he finally came to the conclusion, Titus isn't coming. Now, clearly, Paul said, my spirit was not at rest. Why not? Because I did not find Titus. Now, Paul will explain later on in 2 Corinthians what he means by that. He wasn't worried that something happened to Titus or that Titus had gone off the deep end or something like that. That's not what his worry was. The expectation was, Titus is going to fill me in on what's going on in Corinth. You see, Titus had gone to Corinth. What's happened? Paul wrote 1 Corinthians and addressed many serious problems in the church. Second, he made a visit of his own that did not go well. Third, he sent Titus ahead of time. And then fourth, he writes 2 Corinthians. And part of 2 Corinthians is designed to try to mend some fences, because he says, if this isn't resolved by the time I get there, I am going to deal with it. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 13. I mentioned this a second ago because it mentions the third visit, and we start then piecing together Paul's whereabouts at certain points. But here in 2 Corinthians 13:1, he says, this is the third time I am coming to you. Every charge must be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. I warned those who sinned before and all the others, and I warn them now while absent, as I did when present on my second visit, that if I come again, I will not spare. What is Paul saying? This time, I'm not going to back away. Paul apparently on the second visit got such a resistance, he thought, for the moment, I'm going to back away. Because the goal is to try to restore people. But he says, this time, with all of the efforts that have been made, 1 Corinthians has been written. I've come and tried to hold people accountable. Titus went. And now I'm writing this letter. And at this point, with all of the effort that has been made to restore the fallen and resist the rebellious, he says, the time is up. And I will not spare. I will not hold back when it comes to that. And let's just read verse 3. He says, I will not hold back, since you seek proof that Christ is speaking in me. Now, that ought to blow our minds. And it was distressing to Paul. So we're just rehearsing some of these details about Paul's personal life, because imagine that this is going on while he's in Ephesus. Does he have plenty to do? Plenty to worry about? The Jews are opposing him there. The pagans are opposing him there. There's going to be a huge riot in the city. And what's in his mind? all of this too. And by looking at 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 3, we know that one of the things going on was an element within the church of Corinth was saying, I don't even know if he's speaking for Christ. You seek proof that Christ is speaking in me. Well, I'm bringing it. I'm bringing it. I'm going to bring the proof. And we're going to put this to a rest. So, I revisit these details to fill in a little information about what Paul is experiencing. In addition to what we're going to read about in the latter part of Acts 19, he's got in his mind all of this trouble in Corinth. And it wasn't every member of the church, but they had been influenced by some little ragtag group that moved in and tried to gain influence by running down the Apostle Paul. This wasn't just personal with Paul. This was destroying people's faith. There's serious consequences to say, oh, you don't have to listen to Paul. Just ignore what he says. He's not even one of the 12. Everybody knows that. And so Paul had to deal not just being personally offended, he had to deal with these false teachers who were running him down for the purpose of elevating themselves. That's like a common thing if you haven't caught on to that in human behavior, that if you want to elevate yourself, you tear somebody else down. That's what was going on, and Paul addressed it. So do you feel for Paul? Can you feel for him? Of worrying about Christian people? Worrying about people who were living in sin and had other people telling them, don't worry about it. Don't listen to Paul. He's old-fashioned. That guy, he's just wound tight. Just ignore him. There's the grace of God. Just feel the grace. Paul had these worries, and he had all of these things that he felt obligated to confront. And it was not easy. It was stressful. So, let's go back to Acts chapter 19. And when Paul talks about his travel plans, one thing we can draw on from 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is that these travel plans had included within them a great amount of anxiety. We can't read verse 21. Now, after these things, Paul resolved to go to Macedonia and Achaia and think, hey, he's just going to go by and say hello. He actually is, in a sense, dreading what this might involve. Now, on a positive note, Paul leaves Ephesus. He goes north, he goes west, he goes south into Macedonia, south into Achaia, where Corinth is. And while he was worried and had good reason to worry, it appears from things we read in both 2 Corinthians and Romans, it appears that this particular upcoming visit that Paul, in a sense, dreaded because of what it could be, ended up being very encouraging. For one thing, when he came into Macedonia and eventually connected with Titus, Titus told him, things are looking up, Paul. Things are looking up. in Corinth. Second, this was the part of Paul's travels that included gifts from various congregations to take back to Jerusalem. He says right here, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. And then I hope to go to Rome. And when he comes into Macedonia, Acts 20 and verse 1, and he visits these churches in Macedonia, we read this in 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 9, chapters 8 and 9. He had to restrain the Christian people. He had to say, you've given enough. And you might remember this is the beautiful, beautiful passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 when Paul makes this connection between being impoverished and giving, because he says they were poor and they were giving out of their poverty, even more so. That's when Paul makes this beautiful connection. He who was rich became poor. Who's Paul talking about? Jesus. He who was rich became poor, that through his poverty, what? We might become rich. Paul says that, making a connection between how the Thessalonians and the Philippians, and these people called the Macedonians, that's the area, had first given themselves to the Lord, and then it's no wonder they were generous to give for the spiritual encouragement and the need in Jerusalem. So those are the little details that are gathered from his letters. The trip that he dreaded ends up being very encouraging because of the generosity of the Christians, and things are looking up in Corinth. When we read the book of Romans, Romans is written from Corinth. And it's interesting that he talks about anticipating going to Jerusalem and the generosity of the churches. All right. All of that is anticipated in Acts 19 and verse 21. I'm going to Macedonia and Achaia. Then to Jerusalem. He says, after this, I must also see Rome. Now, turn to Romans chapter 15. Here's another little detail that we can draw from Paul's letter. So he's in Ephesus, right here, Acts chapter 19, verses 21 22. And I'm going to leave here. I'm going to go over to Macedonia and Achaia, and then I got to go to Jerusalem. Then I want to go to Rome. When he gets over to Achaia and he writes to the Romans, he tells them the same thing. I'm coming to see y'all. And he had never been there. In Acts chapter 15, look at verse 22. This is the reason why I have so often been hindered from coming to you, but now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you once I have enjoyed your company for a while. At present, where's Paul when he's writing Romans? He's in Corinth. After he left Ephesus, right after Acts 19, Acts 20 and verse 1, he goes into this area and he's talking about this. He says in verse 25, at present, however, I am going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it. Remember I said that this trip ended up being encouraging? Paul's now at Corinth and he's talking in positive ways about his time in the area. They were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have become to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. When therefore I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness and the blessings of Christ. Now, where is Paul? Corinth. He writes Romans somewhere between Acts 21 and verse 5 when he starts this actual trip back to Jerusalem. Now, I want to draw on something else here. Look at verse 30. I appeal to you, brothers, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to strive together with me in your prayers to God on my behalf, that I may be delivered from the unbelievers in Judea, and that my service for the saints may be acceptable, my service for Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints, so that by God's will I may come to you with joy and be refreshed by your company. When Paul leaves Ephesus, what's he worried about? How's it going to go in Macedonia and Achaia? How's it going to go in Corinth? It's not been going well. There have been people running me down, affecting the faith of people. He goes and he finds things are better than they could have been. When he's there in Corinth, he's writing in positive ways about how the churches in Macedonia and Achaia have contributed to this gift. And now what's he worried about? Well, what's actually going to happen when I get to Jerusalem? He mentions two things. Number one, strive with me in your prayers that I might be delivered from the unbelievers in Judea. We're going to learn in Acts chapter 20, which is in the timeline of Paul traveling back to Jerusalem, that he knows that there are people who are dead set against him in Jerusalem. So it's like he's going there to deliver a gift for the poor. But if he goes into that town, there are also people there that hate him. And he prays that he might be delivered. And that this gift might really actually be accepted. Will these Jewish saints accept money from the Gentile churches? Paul has more in mind here than just alleviating physical suffering. There's a spiritual goal to this benevolence. Now, Acts 19, after Acts 19, as we continue to read Acts, we have the account of Paul going to Jerusalem and all what happens. And here's what we're just recalling for a minute. When Paul is in Corinth and he's writing Romans and he's concerned about what's going to happen, it doesn't go well. He says, after I've gone there and then I want to go to Rome, and after I go to Rome, I'm thinking that you guys could help me go to Spain and go into new areas to preach the gospel. Well, what happens is when he goes to Jerusalem and things blow up there, he finds himself a prisoner for at least 4 years. And so there's a plot to kill him in Jerusalem. He's escorted out of town by soldiers to save his life. He ends up in Caesarea, and there at least for 2 years is in prison. And then we have, in the latter part of Acts, his voyage to Rome as a prisoner because he appealed his case to Caesar. He goes to Rome all right, but in chains. And it's going to be there that he writes Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And he talks about being in chains. And so I just think it's helpful to pull from his letters a few of these details to think about all the concerns that Paul had to deal with. And it reminds me of, I think, a matter that we can all relate to, and I think need to be sensitive of. You really don't know what people are going through. Unless you sit down and talk with them and they confide in you, you just don't know. Somebody might have showed up at the school of Tyrannus one day, and Paul taught a great Bible study, and then went home, and they said, well, the family said, how did it go? Oh, Paul, he taught a great Bible class. There can't be anything going wrong in Paul's life. He was just in such a good mood. Oh, you don't know what Paul's going through. You have no idea that there are people over in Corinth saying terrible things about him. You don't know that he is worried that there are evil unbelievers lying in the weeds waiting to kill him. He's dealing with that too. He's worried about people in Jerusalem coming to an understanding that the gospel is for all, and he has this plan to help the saints with Gentile money. That's weighing on him. Yeah, and the sacrifices that he made. We can't forget that. And so I think when we pull in these details that remind us, when we read Acts 19 and we read he was teaching here and he was doing these miracles and this is what happened, there's a lot going on in his mind, in his life. And that's true for any of us today too. You just never know what all people are dealing with, and all of us can be sensitive to that reality. Well, look here in verse 22. We'll just pick this up for a second, and then we'll be about wrapping it up in terms of time for our class. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. And so Timothy is here. We remember Timothy. And Erasmus is mentioned. And they're going to go on ahead into Macedonia ahead of Paul. Now, it's in verse 23 that we have this incident about the riot. And we'll talk more about this next Lord's Day. But we'll just mention one thing as we introduce this section of the chapter. Verse 23 says, about that time there arose no little disturbance, which is a stylistic way of saying what? What's no little disturbance? A big one. A really, really big one. This was not just, a minor incident. This was a big deal. We'll point out one thing. Look at verse 29. The city was filled with confusion, And they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's traveling companions. So this riot erupts in the city, and they find at least 2 men who are Paul's traveling companions, and they do what? Dragged them. Verse 30. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. Now, whose name is invoked to get this mob stirred up? Paul's. Paul's doing this. Paul's doing that. Paul's going to put us out of business. This riot erupts. How do you think Paul felt knowing his 2 brothers in Christ had been dragged by that mob? He was ready to go. And the disciple says, no, Paul. No. You can't. We won't let you. He writes about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and says, I thought this was the end. He said, I despaired that this was going to be the end of my life. You know what happened to me in Asia, he writes, just not very long after this. You know what happened. How we thought this was it. So I just again bring in something of what we can gather from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, that when this erupts and Paul's traveling companions are down there and in that riot, having been dragged there, Paul wanted to go. And I just can't help but wonder how he felt, knowing they're invoking my name. And they're only caught up in it because they're associated with me. That's just another level of worry. And so we'll talk about the opposition, the riot in Ephesus, and draw a little bit more from 2 Corinthians chapter 1 as how Paul thought about that experience. Well, thank you for being in our class this morning. We'll look forward to continuing our study together.